Welcome to Eclectics, and today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Daniel Tomaszewski, Pharmacy D, Pharm D, who is an assistant professor for the School of Pharmacy at Chapman University since 2014. Dr. Tomaszewski completed his Pharm D in 2009 and completed his PhD in Social and Administrative Pharmacy in 2014 at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy. Dr. Tomaszewski has had a wide variety of teaching, practice, and research experience. Dr. T, and he's actually allowed me to use Dr. T as a shortcut. Dr. T's practice experience has included working in a dispensing role at a variety of community pharmacies, providing medication therapy management at a community mental health clinic and clinical consulting services provided to pharmacy benefit managers, or shortened PBMs. Dr. T's research and teaching has focused on the impact of healthcare policies on the medication use process at the patient level. Today, Dr. T will be discussing the traditional programs and policies implemented by most PBMs that can impact the use of prescription medications by patients. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Tomaszewski.
All right, thank you for the introduction. And it sounds like my mic's coming through clear. Everybody here okay? Okay. If at any point you can't hear me, or if I start trailing off a little bit too much, just throw a hand up. And same goes for questions. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to put your hand up. I'm not one that needs to get through all my material and then ask questions as we're going through it. If something's confusing or if you'd like a little more information, just ask and we'll stop, and I'll field questions whenever they come up. All right, so like Janice hinted at, we're going to be talking a little bit about PBMs and their impact on the medication use process, which oftentimes kind of finds its way into the process because it impacts cost, it impacts drug coverage and where you can get medicines. And so we'll be talking a little bit about PBMs and what they are and how it all fits into the grand scheme of things, because as many of you I'm sure already know, if you're using medications, they can be really expensive. And working with your prescription drug insurance company, who is your PBM, isn't always easy, intuitive, or straightforward for those that are using multiple medications. And so I'd like to just start it off by describing briefly that many people don't realize that you actually have, when you're talking about health insurance, you have two separate categories of health insurance that typically take place. And that goes for most of your employer-based plans, but as well as your Medicare-based plans, where you have this medical benefit, or what we traditionally know as our health insurance, that's paired along with a prescription drug insurance or pharmacy benefit. And it's important to understand the difference between those two, because oftentimes we think we're dealing with our standard insurance company with our prescription drugs, but really they're only handling our medical claims, and then the pharmacy claims come from another entity known as a PBM. And we'll talk about what the PBM does and how they impact drug use as we work through the discussion today. But some of the things that kind of are important to highlight are, you've got this PBM, and what their primary focus is covering all outpatient drugs. So essentially, if you're not in the hospital and you're getting prescription drugs from home, they're covered by the PBM. They're the insurance company paying for those along with your copays. And they may cover some vaccines, particularly when you get into the Medicare space. They're paying for more vaccines at the pharmacy, so your Part D plan may pay for those vaccines getting delivered right at the pharmacy as opposed to going to the clinic. Some may cover MTM services, and if you again are in Medicare and you're enrolled, you may get automatically enrolled in what's called medication therapy management, or MTM. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that's kind of a side piece for your prescription drug benefit. And one of the biggest pieces is upfront billing with prescription drugs and prescription drug insurance. And the reason why I bring that up is it's very different from your medical claims. If you think about when you go to the doctor, if you go to or are admitted to the hospital, you get a bill sometimes weeks after, maybe even months after you've been there, and you find out exactly how much that's actually going to cost you after you've received all of the services. And so oftentimes you have no decision as to whether or not you get those services based on cost until they're already done. Well, pharmacy and PBMs have developed tools so that they allow for what's called real-time adjudication. So when you show up at the pharmacy bills your PBM, and the PBM kicks back a price that you then pay at the pharmacy. That's how the pharmacy knows today your medication is $10 or $25 or $150, because they bill the PBM and the PBM gives them a price right back. It also tells them if your prescription drug isn't covered by your insurance. So that's important to understand as we work through, because if you think about it, what if you brought a prescription drug home that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars and then found out after the fact that your insurance company doesn't cover it? And now you have to turn around and pay the pharmacy that thousands of dollars potentially. Well, luckily, thanks to the PBMs, the way that they have the system set up, those things don't happen. You find out on the spot what that cost is and if there's coverage or not. That also can be frustrating in the pharmacy when you find out how much a drug costs or if the drug isn't covered, because now you're at the pharmacy, you're hoping to start a drug, but you can't get it because it costs several $100s or $1,000, and you have to pay that right there on the spot. So we'll talk about how all those things come into play and how they impact, but the idea behind it of that upfront billing has some convenience factor built in that you don't have to worry about big bills later coming in the mail. So like I had referenced, the separation of your medical bill benefit and your pharmacy benefit carries through to Medicare as well. So how many of you are signed up for Medicare already? All right, so a good number of you. So you probably can be up here giving this lecture better than I can for some of this Medicare discussion we have. You may have already signed up. Part A is hospitalization coverage. So if you end up in the hospital, Part A is paying for it. It's that auto enroll. You sign up right away as Part A. It just happens when you become Medicare eligible. Part B is doctor visits and lab tests. So that's that outpatient medical care, things that happen at the clinic. That one does require you to sign up. And so if you haven't signed up and you're eligible, you either need to receive a waiver or sign up, or you pay a late fee. Part C is kind of an interesting one that is called Medicare Advantage, where it gives you all of your care lumped into a single provider, where you'll have hospital, clinic, as well as prescription drug coverage by one person, like let's say Kaiser may be your provider for your Medicare Advantage plan. And then Part D is a standalone prescription drug benefit. And that's another one that you have to sign up on your own. And so when we talk about PBMs and all the things that happen in the insurance space related to prescription drugs, we're often talking about your Part D plan. And you are required as well to either sign up for a Part C or Part D plan when you become eligible. And if you don't sign up for your Part D plan, that also comes with it fines over the lifetime once you do sign up. So those of you that become eligible, I just like to bring this up because a lot of individuals don't realize they may be only taking one drug or two drugs, and so they think, well, I don't need to sign up for a Part D plan because I don't need that coverage right now. If you delay, there is a fine or a penalty that comes with that. So be sure that once you become eligible, you sign up when that window opens up for you for a Part D plan or a Part C plan that would include the drug coverage. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So what is a PBM exactly? A PBM is essentially a prescription drug insurance company. And so you won't hear me say pharmacy benefit manager here, and I'll almost extensively say PBM because it's easier, shorter. And that's what everybody calls them kind of in the insurance space. And so they oftentimes are offered as a standalone service. So think about Medicare. Part D plans are run by individual PBMs. And so the large PBMs that are out there are called, one of the biggest companies is Express Scripts, you may have heard of. Optum Rx is another one. And then CVS Caremark is a third one. And those are your three largest PBMs that are out there. And so they're all different insurance companies. So if you think about health insurance, those are the things like your Uniteds of the world, your Blue Cross Blue Shields of the world. These are the 3 large prescription drug insurance companies. And they usually run a standalone service. So they're alongside the health insurance space. You've got your United Health, your Blue Cross Blue Shield, or whoever it happens to be providing your medical insurance coverage, but oftentimes the prescription drug is not directly connected to that. Even when you think it is, oftentimes it isn't. If you look at your insurance card, there'll usually be a big logo on there that says, let's say, United Healthcare. But then if you look at a smaller writing, it'll say something about your prescription drug coverage, and it may say ESI, that's Express Scripts. It may say Optum RX, that's Optum Prescription Solutions, or CVS Caremark. And so you may have this health insurance plan, and then this underlying prescription drug benefit that runs on its own. Now, it's important to understand they're separated out because oftentimes we think, well, what's best for you on the medical side, on the prescription drug side, should impact the prescription drug coverage. But they don't talk. So it's important to understand if your medical insurance thinks that this is important for you, but your prescription drug insurance doesn't think you should use that medication, your health insurance has no real say in that. It's the prescription drug insurance that has the final say of what gets covered versus what doesn't. And we'll talk about how they determine those ideas and come up with those process. And then we'll talk about some of the ways that you may interact with them in different what's called utilization management tools they use. So the PBM's primary focus originally was on processing claims prospectively. So like I said, they want to be able to bill the pharmacy to bill your insurance company and for them to get you a price back right there on the spot. And insurance companies don't have that ability. And so this is why PBMs originally were created, is that your insurance companies lack the technology, at least in the 80s, to be able to give a quick turnaround time on if the drug is covered and what is the copay cost. And so, because if you remember, if you go to the doctor or you go to the hospital, you get a bill weeks or months later. You can't do that at the pharmacy. So PBM said, hey, we will become your technological support so that this can happen on the spot. And since they got put in that position, their role has grown considerably. And so nowadays, they also their goal is to serve as a cost containment measure along with the upfront billing. But cost containment sometimes is a good thing and sometimes it's a not so great thing as a patient. Because cost containment sometimes means you don't get the drugs that you want. And then other times it means that you get to save money, which we all like to do. The PBMs of the world sometimes become the favorite group to beat up on because it's easy to be mad that your PBM said you can't get this medication, but maybe sometimes you shouldn't get that medication. It's hard to fully understand why the PBM says you can't get it, so it's just easier to be mad at them than maybe to take a look back and say, maybe there's a better drug out there for me, and we'll talk about kind of some examples of how that may show up. All right, so the goal of a PBM right now and what they're trying to do is 3 primary things. They want to make sure that you have appropriate medication use. So for instance, if you ever go to get a prescription and it says refill too soon, and they're looking back to say, are you taking too much of your medication every day, so you're running out too soon and you're filling too soon? So maybe you're only supposed to be taking 1 tablet a day and you've been taking 2 tablets a day. And they'll say, well, that's not appropriate use. We got to find out why this patient is running out so early and figure out, is it appropriate for them to be using it that way? And also, is the medication itself appropriate? Are you on the right medication for your disease state? And we'll talk about how they try to figure that out. They're working on affordability of medications. So PBMs do significant contracting. And part of that contracting is trying to negotiate lower rates with the pharmacy so that you get a discount on your prescription drugs while you're there. They're also looking at accessibility to medications. They're trying to find as many pharmacies that they can get in a network so that you can go to every corner drugstore and pick up your prescription whenever it's convenient to you. Or it may get delivered right to your house via mail order pharmacy. And so you no longer have to go to the pharmacy to get the prescription, it comes right to you. Now, depending on if you follow prescription drug news and things like that, you may have read stories about some of the abuses that come with these things. And maybe you like to go to your corner drugstore and you no longer can and you're forced into mail. And so again, this is where the PBMs oftentimes become that favorite business that people like to hate because they get mad about these things. And it's fair because sometimes the insurance company, the PBM, is doing it also to make sure it's most cost effective for them, maybe not for you. Again, primary outcome is, again, ensure cost effective use of prescription medications. They want to make sure the drugs you're using do everything they can for you at the lowest cost to them, the insurance company, but also to you as the end user or patient. Okay, so if you think about it and how PBMs have really, for those of you, it's kind of a not great image further away, but this is a large crowd. So if you take a look at this large crowd, and let's think of them as a group of covered insurers. You're all patients here. And now you have the opportunity to either go to the pharmacy and try to negotiate a price down for a single drug that you're all using. Let's say everybody in this picture uses insulin. And you can either go negotiate with the pharmacy yourself and try and get your insulin for cheaper, or you can have a business entity like a PBM that goes in and says, I've got 10,000 people that fill insulin at your pharmacy. What's your lowest price you're willing to give me to keep those patients coming back to you? Do you think you're going to get a lower price, or do you think the PBM will get a lower price negotiated? The PBM, right? So one of the PBM's ideas are that the negotiation power that comes with numbers. And so the more patients you can bring to the pharmacy, the more price concessions those pharmacies are often willing to accept. And so let's say they normally would charge $700 for insulin. They may contract with your PBM and say, we'll sell it to you for $400. And so you get a substantial reduction in that cost of the insulin that in theory gets passed along to the end user or the patient. And does that always happen? No. But in theory, that's how it works. The PBM negotiates a better price, which you then get to see as a patient. And so it's oftentimes using this strategy to negotiate lower prices, negotiate better deals. And so this is where they may require you to use certain pharmacies. They may push you into mail order, because then the more people they have using mail order, the better the rate they can get with the mail order provider, potentially. And so it's all about a numbers game with the PBMs and contracting. Yes?
I'm getting a bit lost because I feel a distinction between pharmaceuticals, those who produce and wholesale, and pharmacies that retail.
Yes, so there is the world of prescription drug pricing is a very complicated space, and so that's a great question. So the question, did everybody hear it?
No.
Okay, I'll repeat. So the question is, he's wondering about what about the pharmacy manufacturers who are making the drug, and then the pharmacies that I'm talking about right now, and how does that impact, kind of work together along with these PBMs? So what happens is there are multiple places the PBM is contracting. They're contracting with the pharmacy to drive down prices on the price that the pharmacy is charging, but they are also at the same time contracting with the prescription drug prescription drug manufacturers. And so I don't usually, with most people, I won't get too in depth with it because it starts to get complicated. But just think of it this way on the pharmacy side of things. When you go to buy a car, you got the list price at the Ford dealership. And it may say it's $35,000, but you know that the Ford dealership didn't pay $35,000 to buy it from Ford, right? Maybe they got it for $28,000. And so if you negotiate the price down, you can maybe negotiate it down to $30,000, and so that $7,000 markup becomes a $2,000 markup. So that's what the PBMs are doing with the pharmacies. Now, the PBMs in that same scenario, if they were dealing with Ford, would say, you're charging the dealer $28,000, but I know you're making this truck for $12,000. How about you give me a rebate that you send directly to me to cut the price even further, and then I get a rebate check coming from Ford. So that would be the same with the prescription drug manufacturers. Say Pfizer, who is making Lipitor, they go to Pfizer and say, we know it's only costing you 50 cents per tablet and you're charging $5 per tablet. Give us a $2 rebate for every tablet that we sell through our prescription drug insurance. And then they'll get a check from Pfizer. Now, you don't get to see any of that usually. That's happening behind the closed doors. That's between the PBM and Pfizer. Again, in theory, your PBM should pass that savings along to you, because really what they're paying, they should be charging you, but that doesn't always happen. And when I say that doesn't always happen, that rarely happens.
In fact, it's never happened.
Well, I wouldn't say it never. So as Janice, I do consulting for some of these companies, and some of them are very honest companies that pass along all savings. An example is there's a company that does these services with Costco. And Costco has a cost savings program for members to come in where all rebates that are negotiated get passed directly to the member. And so when you go to buy a drug without your insurance at Costco, whatever price you got includes the rebate that the PBM has negotiated for contract, or for Costco. So it does happen, but it's very few that do. We'll go here and then I'll come up top. Question?
Who determines the formulary, the insurance company or the PBM?
The PBM, and we're going to talk about how the formula, so who determines the formulary? And so it's a great lead-in because we're going to get to formulary and then how it's decided next. And then a question in the back.
Well, my question is, I take a drug called valsartan, which is a generic of Diavan. We
Yep.
have to take the generic because that's what they say. My insurance, or the pharmacy, provided the drug by a company called Aurobindo, which is a huge company in China. I found out there were a lot of complaints about the drugs. And I, as a customer, have no choice as to who they buy the drugs from. This is a big deal because all the sources were from China. I don't like drugs from China. And I said, I want a drug from the United States. And they said, well, you know, too bad. So they finally found one from a company that was acceptable. I mean, it's still you know, and it may be owned by the United States, but it's made in China, which has very bad control. So we as patients have very little control. It's not just money, it's also quality.
So great question, great point. So where are these drugs always coming from? And here's what I will say to that. Although I understand what you're saying, we're going to talk a little bit about generic drugs in a short while. The difficulty that comes with, let's say, reporting of patients about complaints about this drug from China. The FDA has the same standards for that drug that comes in from China as they do for the drug that is produced here down the road. And so the struggles with prescription drugs is that if you use anecdotal reporting about patients who don't like drugs from a certain company, there are no winners. Because the people that report out complaints or that, not only, the people that do any sort of reporting about prescription drugs aren't the ones that love the generic drug from a certain company. So it doesn't matter if the generic drug company was just down the road. You could go online and you'll find just as many complaints oftentimes as the one that's produced in China. But the standards are the same.
But they're not. China has no control.
But the FDA does. And the FDA does not allow any drugs into our system that they do not personally regulate.
So they go to China and look at the drug.
Correct. So they get their manufacturing facilities. The FDA is going to their manufacturing facilities to make sure that they meet standards as well. But also the drugs, once they come into the marketplace here, also undergo testing to show that they are meeting the standards that the FDA expects for drugs coming in.
Well, this particular drug dissolved almost immediately and it didn't behave well. So I had a reason to complain about it. But anyway, just one.
Yeah, no, and so you're going to run into situations like that, and what often is it's a market-based system, and so when you do have product like, let's say they get it into the pharmacy and there's a bunch of broken tablets, those companies don't last long because the pharmacies stop ordering from them. But I will say this much, the manufacturing process and expectations about tablets and everything that comes in, it is no different from China, Israel, and Israel is a big producer of our generic drugs. Puerto Rico is a big producer of generic drugs. Wherever they're coming from, the expectation is they meet FDA standards. And so, we'll leave it there.
Who is able to bring in drugs? I, as an individual, can't go out and get it. Can the pharmacies go out and get the drug?
So, again, because the FDA system is so regulated that the FDA has to approve it coming into the country. So let's say you have Chinese manufacturers or manufacturers in Israel that are bringing drug in. They have to have a company housed here that's going to bring the drug in for them, like Teva Pharmaceuticals. A lot of the drugs you'll see are Teva produced. They're an Israeli company, but they have also strong grounds here in the US because they may have manufacturing overseas, but all the products come back here as the company bringing it into the US, and then they have to demonstrate that they are meeting, again, FDA standards and requirements to enter it into the system. You individually are not allowed to bring it back into the system because of the fact that you don't have the ability to test those drugs to determine standards of quality and safety. And so you can't go online and order from outside the country and have it sent in, or go outside the country and bring it back in. Technically is potentially illegal. They can embargo it when you come back across, but many go to Canada and bring it back. But that's a whole nother talk. But technically, the companies, the manufacturers are the ones that bring it back in and allow it to enter into the system. Yes?
But do the FDA standards require a minimum cost for the drugs?
No, FDA does not have any say or any question about costs. They do not consider costs when they're reviewing product. They are simply reviewing product for safety and effectiveness, and then for generics that they are consistently produced in line with the branded agents. Yes?
I'm able to get drugs through the mail from Canada.
Yeah, so you may be getting them from Canada through the mail, but you're not allowed to. Now, so I just say that in the sense that some shipment may not come in because they got embargoed coming through customs. But there are plenty of people that do it. And so the rule of law says if they are getting mailed in from a pharmacy in Canada, that is technically not allowed. Yes?
There was an item in the news last week that you go to a pharmacy and your price for a drug is so much on your insurance plan, but if you ask them what the cash price is, sometimes that's lower.
Yeah, so we'll get to that maybe, depending on how many questions, which is great. Keep asking the questions. I'm happy to take them. But that is part of what we're going to talk about a little bit later. And part of that is, again, this PBM contracting piece, which gets a little convoluted at times. And so it's not as simple and straightforward as they always bring you the best price. And that's where asking the cash price sometimes is of value. Now, I will say this much. They talk about asking drug prices and cash prices that you may save money, and you may, but it's a very small fraction of prescriptions, actually. Because most contracts with the PBM, so I was talking about how the PBM contracts with the pharmacy, most PBMs say they use what's called a lesser of logic. And what that lesser of logic is, I will pay you as an insurance company, the pharmacy, our contracted rate, so whatever we've agreed upon on our contract, or your cash price, whichever one is lower. But there are some that don't do that, and those are the rare instances where you might find a generic drug where it saves you money. So it's always good to ask, but oftentimes you're going to find that it's either the same or the cash price is higher.
I wasn't aware of the PBM as its own separate kind of, from my personal point of view, I know shared by a number of people here, who are members of Kaiser. Does Kaiser, is their PBM, in a sense, in-house?
It is. So you brought up the one great example, and eventually I would have gotten there, but there is a very small subset of entities that run it in-house. And Kaiser technically runs it in-house. You notice how Kaiser, you have to use Kaiser pharmacies? That means that they're running it internally. So they keep everything closed door in-house. They run their own formulary, their own decisions around it. They do partner with a PBM on the billing side just for the technology piece, but everything else is handled in-house with Kaiser.
Yes.
All right, which has some good and some not so good, because you got to go to the Kaiser pharmacy if you need drugs.
One question, chemotherapy, drugs produced for chemo, they're sometimes monopolized by companies. So they tell the doctor, you know, you either use this or we shut you off. And the price, of course, is skyrocketing.
Yeah, so that's again, the contracts between doctors and chemo manufacturers and manufacturers in general are a whole nother talk. But oftentimes what it is less about you have to use this or we shut you off. It's they may be contracted with that manufacturer to actually get some sort of stipend to continue using their product or some additional services from them to use their product. And so, because again, the manufacturers want the physicians to write prescriptions for their drug. And so they may be entering into an agreement as well. Many hospitals are banning those agreements now, but that wasn't the case historically. And so it's difficult to say exactly what's going on there, but that's the prescription drug manufacturer and not necessarily the PBM that's acting there.
The only way you're going to know is when, you know, the doctor says you need this chemical, and I can't get it anymore. You know, and so the only person left out here is the patient.
And sometimes it is, absolutely. And there's drug shortages, availability of product. The drug channel is a great discussion to have, but in the confines of today, I don't think we're going to solve that problem or really be able to answer the question because there's so many pieces that come with that. So that could be another discussion, I would say. We're just running a whole list of how many. I may be here all semester next time. I'll just.
Is there an appeal process?
There is. And so we'll talk about what's called a prior authorization, and then I'll hit on the appeals process that comes along with it, too. Again, if we get there. I think we're 4 slides in, and I'm half an hour of my time's gone. So, all right. So most benefit designs are really hinged on what's called a formulary. Does anybody know what a formulary is? Yeah, we've got some hands up. Who wants to share what essentially it is? Yeah, it's essentially a list of preferred drugs. Okay, anything else to add?
And there are tiers.
And then the tiers to it of how preferred they are. There are a list of preferred drugs, and then they list them in tiers based on how well they prefer them. And so essentially, again, list of preferred, and then it defines the cost sharing based on preference, so based on tiering. And then it's the effort of the PBM to drive patients to use specific prescription drugs. And as a patient, you may be hearing that and thinking to yourself, that's terrible. I don't want them to tell me what drugs I'm going to use. I want my prescriber to tell me what drugs I'm going to use, or I want to choose what that is. But sometimes your prescriber doesn't make the right decision. And sometimes it's because you've made the wrong decision as a patient because you've seen a wonderful commercial and you really want a certain drug and you think it's the drug you need, but really sometimes it's not the drug you need. And so the PBM sometimes is trying to step in and say, are we sure this is the drug we need? Because looking at it on an outside perspective, it doesn't seem like it is. And I'll give you an example of it to kind of highlight what I mean by that so that you can get it, and we'll talk a little bit about those commercials in a second here. All right, but the formulary typically is a 4-tier system nowadays. Used to be 2 tiers, then it became 3 tiers, now it's 4 tiers. I actually have seen up to 6 tiers at this point. It's called inflation. I don't know, well, the drug inflation to some degree, but it's a new drug products that are coming out to the market. But typically speaking, you've got tier 1, your lowest copay generic. It's your lowest copay, and it usually has your preferred products, which are all generics. So your generic drug tier is tier 1. Tier 2 is higher cost, but it's still your preferred higher cost agents, so it's your preferred brand name only drugs. And then tier 3 is your non-preferred products, again, brand name only agents, but maybe are your non-preferred agents within a single group. Tier 4 is now specialty, and specialty is a separate group of medications. Your chemotherapy agents usually fall under specialty. Almost all your injectables besides insulin are on specialty. So these are your Humiras, your Enbrels, your Taltz, all of these products that are extremely expensive. And when I say extremely expensive, a tier 3 agent may run you up to $1,000 cash price. Your tier 4 agents may run you up to $20,000 cash price for a single agent. Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but there's ways around trying to figure out that price. So experimentals do not make formulary, because to be on a formulary, you have to be FDA approved to enter into that space. If they are experimental agents that are still in the process of getting approved, they are considered non-formulary, usually non-covered items.
That'd be arranged with the physician or the drug company, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so that would be like getting into a clinical trial, or outside of a clinical trial where they're allowing some last option exceptions where a patient may get access to it. But your prescription drug insurance company almost always will not pay for that situation. And so you're then working directly usually with the product manufacturer to see what you can work out price-wise. Okay, so the goal of the formulary, like we've already talked about, is driving patient choice to preferred products. And I spelt choose. I don't know where that came from, but that's supposed to say choice. And you reduce overall cost for patients when using preferred drugs. So if you go get a tier 1 generic, we charge you the least amount of money because we want you to use that drug. So we drive the cost down for you to allow you to get access. And then by placing them, particularly if we're looking between tier 2 and tier 3, if they're brand name only drugs, the PBM can use that positioning either as tier 2 or tier 3 to help improve their negotiation ability with the prescription drug manufacturer. And so tier 2 and tier 3 oftentimes is they'll get a much better rebate from a drug company if they make it tier 2 as opposed to if they make it tier 3. And I'll provide some examples, but typically speaking, you see tier 2 you charge nominally a little bit more than tier 1, and then tier 3 you may charge a lot more than tier 1 because you don't want patients to use it unless they have to. Yes?
There are occasions where you're charged as far as copay, tier 3, but then you must go through an appeal process to get back down to tier 2.
So some insurance companies or some PBMs allow that to happen. Many don't. Many will put a appeal process or a prior authorization in place to gain you access to tier 3, but you still have to pay the tier 3 copay. So you actually got a pretty good PBM that says, if you absolutely need the tier 3, maybe we'll let you get it at a tier 2 drug price. But that is happening less and less often. Yeah?
We have all been exposed to numerous ads on television for specific brand name drugs. The pharmaceutical company is doing this to make a profit. Where does the PBM come in mediating between the demand of the patient created by the TV?
Yeah, so you got a couple of things that are happening there. You first have your clinicians that are your prescribers that are stuck in this middle place where they've got to mediate your request, and maybe they add to the problem. And the free samples, again, is a whole nother discussion. But the free samples add to that problem because they get you started on a brand name drug that maybe isn't the right drug for you. And then you try to go get it from your PBM, and your PBM says, we're not paying for that because that's the wrong drug. But the physicians the prescribers are the first mediator there. The second mediator is the PBMs oftentimes don't care what your request is. Now that's not to say they don't care. Some of them, again, they want you to get the right drug, but they can't see into the doctor's office to see what that discussion was. So if you come in and you're a newly diagnosed diabetes patient, because we'll use that as an example as we kind of work our way out, and you want to start on Jardiance as your first drug, because you saw this wonderful commercial that we're going to try and watch in a little bit here, and you say, I want to start with Jardiance. And your prescriber tries to tell you, well, maybe it's not the best drug, and you say, I want Jardiance. And they write the script for you and they give it to you for Jardiance. Then you go to the pharmacy bills your PBM says, nope, not paying for it. Because you need to use metformin first. And if you don't use metformin first, we're not paying for it. And so that's their combat. They say, no coverage until you use this first. We don't care what the wonderful commercial said. Based on what we know, this is the best product for you. And so the formulary is how they combat those commercials. Yes?
So I'm an RN working with a cancer patient who took Neulasta, and she had to go back into the doctor's office to get the shot. And that was a hardship for her. So trying to get it mailed to her house so she could do her own injection, the insurance wouldn't pay for it if it was mailed to her house. But if she went to her doctor's office, they would. Why?
Yeah, so remember how we talked in the beginning, you have medical and then you have pharmacy? So because she's getting it delivered in clinic, it is considered a medical benefit. To ship it to the house to use at home, it's a prescription drug benefit now. Now, you don't have duplicate coverages usually under those two windows. Remember, they're separate usually and on their own. So if Neulasta is covered under a medical benefit, it would be a prescription drug exclusion. And so they don't allow for that coverage to take place at home. Yeah. Again, the system is set up in a certain way. It's not the most efficient way. It's not the most patient-friendly way always, but it is the system we work in. And so that's a cause of the system at that point where they say it has to be done in a medical office and you have to go there to get it. Okay, so like I said, Jardiance. You know, thinking about these, so we are talking about the PBM trying to drive patient choice. But when you're trying to drive patient choice, you need the patient to be willing or open to trying something different. And the problem is when we get commercials, okay, we're going to try and get this, but we may not be able to get it to work. So give me 1 second. I'm going to try, and if it doesn't happen, I'll just describe it to you. I'm guessing, have you all seen this commercial? It's all over the TV.
No, I fast forward.
In fact, yeah, you're lucky enough to be able to just fast forward past. All right, so here we go. Let's see if our internet connection is working. If not, I'll just describe it to you. Oh, all right, it's not working. That's okay. We're not going to get hung up on it because it's just a fun little commercial. So the commercial runs through this gentleman here on the right, going around and talking to diabetic patients on the street. And what he's highlighting in the discussion in the commercial is talking to patients that that have diabetes if they understand that diabetes puts them at an increased risk for heart attack or other cardiovascular events, they call them. And many patients that have diabetes don't realize that having diabetes can put you at risk for these events taking place later on if your diabetes isn't well controlled. And so the reason why they're doing that commercial is Jardiance had a study come out to show that they slightly reduce the rate of cardiovascular events or heart attacks in diabetic patients. So it's showing that it's reducing that risk of you having a heart attack if you have diabetes. And so that's a big deal on the research side of things. And so they're trying to highlight this to get you to choose Jardiance if you are diagnosed with diabetes, or if you're newly diagnosed in particular. They want you to start with Jardiance. That sounds great, right? As a patient, you would say, well, I have a diabetes. I want to be on Jardiance because it reduces my risk of heart attack. And I agree, as a patient myself of anything, if I heard that it would make me healthier or better, I would say, yes, I need Jardiance now from moving forward. The problem with that is this commercial doesn't highlight that metformin a generically available drug that's been around forever, reduces your risk of heart attack considerably even more than Jardiance does. But does the commercial tell you that? No. Do the producers of metformin tell you that? No, because it's generic, right? So there's no brand name metformin producer. And Jardiance went out and got an FDA-approved indication, which is kind of a big deal for the reduction in cardiovascular events in diabetic patients. Metformin doesn't have that indication. And the reason for it is because the trials they ran to show that it reduced heart rates, the research that was done, came much later after metformin was no longer a branded product. Nobody, again, is going to pay to go back and do more FDA approval process to get that added to a generic drug. So Jardiance, when these commercials first came out, they were able to say, we are the only diabetic drug that has an indication for reducing heart attacks. So you need to start with Jardiance as a diabetic patient. Metformin reduces it twice as well, but they're not able to come out and say, actually, we have better results than Jardiance because nobody's paying for that to happen. And so, as you can imagine, patients are coming into the office and they want Jardiance now. And the PBM, in reality, what do we want? We want our patients to be the healthiest and making the best decision. The prescriber is put in a tough spot because Jardiance does have some good data out on it now, but it happens to cost somewhere around the mark of, I think, $600 for 30 days, whereas metformin in some formulations costs $6 for 30 days. And so you can imagine it's a big discrepancy and it's a difficult place to put a prescriber in. And these are the situations where PBMs make a lot of sense to play the bad guy. Because now they can step in and say, you know what, actually metformin is better for you. And so this is what we call the medication use process. And the first part of it is the prescribing part. And you see up here that, us academics here that work at the university will say, well, the prescribing process includes the patient and the provider or the prescriber making a decision. And oftentimes there is outside pieces that are pushing that decision. And so the idea is that you should be making a clinical decision that gives you the best drug choice. But the newest thing does not always mean the best thing. And the newest thing is what everybody wants. And so the PBM has to kind of intervene to try and improve that drug choice at times. Now I think maybe I don't. Okay, I'll go back. I thought I had another slide here, but I guess I don't. Part of the idea here and what the PBM is often doing when they're making decisions around what drugs to cover is they're using what's called evidence-based or guideline-driven medicine. So it's, what's that?
Standard of care.
So what is the standard of care and what does the research suggest as our best drug for our patients? And so I thought I clipped it in, but I guess I didn't. There's a nice little slide that can show you what the American Diabetes Association guideline-driven prescribing suggests. Their #1 drug that they suggest everybody should start out with is metformin. And then you can go to one of a slew of different drugs, including Jardiance, as maybe your second option. But they say, and they have no game in this, the ADA, although they're getting money from drug companies and those kind of things, but they're usually pretty, so you have to know the guidelines. The ADA puts out actually a very quality, research-driven guideline, and they say metformin, which they're not making any money off of, you should always start with metformin, period. And so what the PBM then says, most PBMs will say, you have to start with metformin. And if you don't start with metformin, we're not going to cover any other drug. We don't care how wonderful that commercial is for Jardiance. And so this is one of those times where it's a good thing to have the PBM actually step in because we know metformin works better. Metformin reduces heart attacks. It reduces diabetes-related ocular problems, going blind because of diabetes. Lower limb amputations, metformin does better than anything else. Sugar control, metformin does better than anything else. So we know metformin is the best drug out there unless you end up on insulin because you need to be on insulin, but metformin should be used first. And so the PBM tries to step in and say, all of our patients have to try metformin first. That's a good, that should be a good step. But it doesn't feel that way as a patient, right? As a patient, you want Jardiance. And you can't get it, so you're mad at your PBM. But maybe they're making a good decision for you.
Well, how does Jardiance match up with metformin when it compares to those two with diabetic retinopathy and renal disease and the other thing? How do the two compare?
So if you do Jardiance in a trial versus metformin, never going to happen. And the reason being is that Jardiance is putting out commercials and metformin isn't. So does the manufacturer of Jardiance want a head-to-head trial against metformin? No, because they're likely going to lose. And at best be the same. And so by putting out that data, now that data is out there, and they have to report out that data. Versus if they just run it against placebo and show a reduction, so against a sugar pill, and they're always going to, I shouldn't say sugar pill because it's not really sugar. That would be, cruel and unusual for a diabetic patient to do sugar pill. But that's what a placebo is. It's just, powdered filled tablet or capsule that has no drug in it. So if they go against a placebo, they're going to win likely. And then they'll be able to put out these wonderful commercials. Now, we can take the data of metformin alone, and we take the data against Jardiance alone, and compare it, and metformin does better. But you can't come out and say that directly because there are no head-to-head trials. So you're not allowed to come out and say metformin, as somebody that would put out, let's say, a public service commercial. They can't come out and say metformin is better than Jardiance because there's no studies to show that it is. But the numbers certainly point out that it is. Yeah?
Lipitor generic is different every time you get a prescription.
Potentially.
No, not potentially. There are cases where how they put the pill together uses a different system. So the FDA, hey, we all go to pharmacies. One time you get Lipitor, it comes in this size, and the next time it comes in a different size, which means it came from a different manufacturer.
Correct.
The China system, if you would. I am told, could be wrong, but known that happened, that Lipitor done in company A doesn't exactly do the same in company B. Would you comment?
Yeah, well, actually, how about let's wait till we get to the generic drugs, and I'll answer that question directly in the generic drug section. But it's a great question, and absolutely. And the reason for it is you again, have a very complicated supply chain, a very complicated system here in the US, and you have multiple manufacturers. But let's say manufacturer A has any sort of slowdown in production for XY reason, and they can't make enough to sell to the wholesaler right now. So company B picks up that slack, and it becomes the go-to generic manufacturer for that wholesaler, and then the pharmacy is really just buying from the wholesaler. So oftentimes it's based off of availability and cost of those generic drugs that they can get in. So you may have a different manufacturer throughout the year at any individual pharmacy. And to request a specific generic manufacturer is very difficult to do, because it is all about supply and availability. And if I can't get Teva, you can't have Teva. And so, at the pharmacy. And oftentimes it's very difficult at the pharmacy to be able to choose a single manufacturer because it goes through the wholesaler, and the wholesaler has to have it in order to get it. But we can talk about the intricacies of the production in a little bit.
When you say the FDA ensures that the same chemical to the same quantity is in the different medications, like he's talking about,
yeah.
You do with Celebrex, the same kind of thing. Does the FDA check frequently enough, and do they do random testing instead of scheduled testing, so that they can actually detect differences? Yeah, so the FDA just grabs drug off shelf. It's random. And so if you have drugs sitting at a wholesaler, they grab and check. Now the company is also running spot checks and have to report that data out to the FDA to demonstrate that it's putting out the same product over and over again. The FDA can just show up at your manufacturing site any day they want. Oftentimes, companies are so concerned about the FDA coming in and shutting them down. Most of the recalls and shutdowns actually take place because the company themselves
found a problem, reported it to the FDA, and did a voluntary recall. Because if you don't do that, the FDA can shut you down for a long time. Anybody remember a few years back you couldn't get brand name Tylenol for a long time? The FDA shut down the producers of brand name Tylenol until they could demonstrate that they'd solved the problem because they didn't do a voluntary recall fast enough. And there wasn't anything wrong with the product itself. They found bacteria in the storage facility where these products were being stored. And so they couldn't guarantee that that bacteria didn't make it into the product. And so they pull all that product back. They have to demonstrate all of their manufacturing sites no longer have that bacteria. The FDA is right there alongside verifying it. And they don't allow you to start selling drug again until you get to that point where the FDA is comfortable. And so is the FDA doing all they can to make sure you're getting quality product? I would argue yes.
How does the FDA compare, say, with European manufacturers, Japanese, federal?
Federal regulation. So oftentimes, many of these European unions rely to some degree on the FDA to do a lot of the heavy lifting, because a lot of the product that is going into other countries, let's say Canada, are coming from the same manufacturing sites that the US is doing. But to get a drug into the FDA supply chain is much more difficult than to get into most other countries. Now, the only other difficulty that's added in is that the international regulators care about price. And so they may say you don't get entry into our system based on price, not necessarily manufacturing concerns.
Does Canada have a system more or less like, would you feel comfortable buying any drug in Canada based on quality of their control system?
Yeah, so I would feel comfortable. But here's what you have to realize is if you're not driving to Canada, if you're ordering them online from a Canadian pharmacy, it may be a Canadian pharmacy. And you may be ordering from India, you may be ordering from some third world country, because nobody is verifying that the Canadian pharmacy online is in Canada.
And so for a legitimate Canadian pharmacy, there'd be no problem, but just, of course, obviously, if it's online, it can be anywhere.
Correct.
Okay.
And anytime they're willing, because they know they're not allowed to ship to the US. And so many pharmacies are not willing to do that. I only know of a couple that are willing to do that at least reported out that are willing to do it. And so if they're not willing to do it, it suggests that, or if they're willing to do it, it's a red flag for me to start with. And then I'd verify a little bit more. There is one exception to the rule of being able to ship into the US, I should add. If there's a drug that is approved in another country but not approved in the US, you may be able to get an exception to allow it to ship in. And so, like the UK had a drug that was available for a long time, only in the UK, a cancer agent, and it wasn't available in the US, so you could have that shipped over and it's fine, it's gonna clear customs, no problem. But as soon as it becomes available in the US, you can no longer have it ship over. And as I'm sure you're guessing, as soon as that drug became available in the US, it went from costing approximately, I think, $1,000 up to about $12,000 a month. But you can no longer get it sent to you. But again, very different systems, and so it's I just like to bring that up just because that can happen. Okay, so how does a formulary get developed? And I've sat on some P&T committees. I currently provide clinical support services for P&T committees. And what a P&T committee is, it's a pharmacy and therapeutics committee. It's usually a group of prescribers, physicians, and pharmacists, and then sometimes a patient advocate, sometimes other healthcare providers, like a nurse or a physician assistant or something along those lines. And so what they are doing is the P&T committee reviews new drugs as they come out, and they make recommendations to the PBM as to whether or not they should cover those products or not. And they may also recommend if they should prefer them or make them non-preferred. And so what they're trying to do is they're supposed to focus on clinical outcomes. So the P&T is supposed to operate separately from the cost window and really look at what does this drug do, how safe is it, how effective is it, and then should we prefer it. So an example going back to, again, Jardiance. They may see the Jardiance data come out and say, we should cover this is good quality data, so we're happy to cover it, and we should prefer it as the brand. but they may not be the ones that put in place the step therapy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that says you have to use metformin first. Or they may say that. They say, we really like Jardiance, we should prefer it, but we should put a requirement that you try metformin first, and then it's our preferred agent after metformin. So that's the kind of decisions they're making. And they don't care how much Jardiance, technically they shouldn't care how much it costs. They're looking clinical data. Is it a good quality drug that we want to cover? Question?
Does each PBM or each insurance company have their own P&T committee? They
do. So at each PBM or prescription drug insurance company typically runs their own P&T committee. They vary, absolutely. Have any of you ever switched from one Part D plan to another Part D plan?
Yes.
Did your copays change or did your coverage change?
Yes.
Yes. So it can be a complete mess if you're not careful, because one P&T committee may have a completely different idea around coverage than another. And then the other piece that really can impact it is the P&T committee may say, okay, so Jardiance is called an SGLT2. It's a type of drug that treats diabetes. There are multiple SGLT2s on the market. There is Jardiance, Invokana, and Farxiga. I think those are the only three right now. Now, what the P&T committee might say is, Jardiance has great data, but they're the first ones to come out with data for these SGLT2s. We don't see any reason why we wouldn't expect the same results from Jardiance as Invokana and Farxiga. So they may say as a P&T committee, we should prefer an SGLT2, but we allow the PBM to decide which one's tier 2 and which one's tier 3, because we view them as all equally as good, until data suggests otherwise. And so this is where you may switch from one Part D plan to another, and say you were on Jardiance, then you transition to another Part D plan, and they say, oh, you have to use Invokana. And so now you either have to transition to Invokana, or you're paying more for your drug, or you're paying cash price for your drug. Yes?
Is there a way to find out, prior to making your change on a D program, what it's all about?
Yes. So Part D plans, you can go into, there's an online portal and enter in all of your drugs, and it will kick out coverage of different options for you. And it'll tell you the tier and your cost sharing, and it'll actually pick out, if you enter in your drugs, it'll try and tell you your most cost-effective Part D plan that they would recommend. And so it'll say, well, if you choose this one, your out-of-pocket cost will be $1,000. But if you choose this one, it's going to be $1,400. And so there is an online portal put out by Medicare that you can run through with that, with CMS. And there's a lot of centers that will actually help you go through the process. Some pharmacies will help you go through the process when it's open enrollment. Pharmacists like myself actually can't help you with it. It's a goofy part of the Part D law that says pharmacists aren't able to help because we may drive you to a Part D plan that is best for our pharmacy, not best for you, which is ridiculous. I have no idea what my pharmacy's ever getting paid because of the PBM space, and with the large nature of pharmacy these days, it's impossible for me to figure out. But that's, if you're ever interested in it, you can either Google it or you can try and find some senior centers oftentimes are offering that service.
I'm not asking for a full declarative sentence, but your general sense. Anytime I see the focus is supposed to be, technically it's, what is your sense of how focused on clinical results the P&T committees are?
So oftentimes the P&T committee themselves are fairly, I would say in general, are focused on clinical outcomes. Now, what you may have are much more, you have some P&T committees that are much more willing to extrapolate or expand data to other drugs within a class than others are. So a P&T committee that I sit on and I make recommendations towards with Jardiance, we recommended preferring Jardiance and only Jardiance as SGLT2 preferred agent. Many others, especially the big companies, will be much more willing to expand it as a class outcome, which then allows the business side of it to drive the decision of which drug is preferred. And so, if you're more willing to be, loose with everything in this class probably is great, then that's where that piece that's usually the disconnect between P&T and maybe the decisions that get put in place for the tiering. So we used to, in another example, I used to sit on the Minnesota State Medicaid programs P&T committee. It was an open discussion. Members of the community could come. It's an open meeting. And so, that's another example of very clinically driven, very willing to share why they're making their decisions because they want the public to know that this isn't a prescription drug company ploy to get you using a certain product. What they're reviewing is usually medical and clinical literature. So what does the research say? So when Jardiance came out with this new research, we re-review Jardiance because when it first came out, it was fine. It was another diabetes drug, nothing too exciting. It lowered A1Cs, which is a measure of 3-month blood sugar levels. Okay, not amazing. Oh. Keep hitting an extra button here. So we said, we'll make it a tier 3, nothing exciting about it. But then it came out and it had this CV risk reduction, which is great. We said, okay, let's re-review it based off of the medical literature. It's got good safety marks still, and it's got good effectiveness marks now. So, it makes sense now to bump it from a tier 3 to a tier 2, but we still want to make sure our patients work their way through metformin. So we bumped it down to tier 2. It's cheaper for the patient, but we put in place what's called a step therapy that we'll talk about in a little bit, which essentially says you have to try metformin first, and then you gain access to this drug. So they're looking at safety, adverse effects, contraindications. So these are things like the drug manufacturer may come out and say, if you have kidney insufficiency, your kidneys aren't working very well, you shouldn't use Jardiance.
Efficacy is not on that list.
Oh, so that would come up here under the medical and clinical literature. So effectiveness is definitely there. I apologize. I just didn't carry it over. So that's absolutely a part of it. It's the secondary to safety. So it's safety and effectiveness, and these are the pieces that they're really evaluating on the safety side of things. And then lastly, some will consider cost. And again, oftentimes they try to leave costs completely out of it because that's the business side that's dealing with the cost. And we're making clinical decisions.
When you look at costs, there is the cost of production and the cost of consumption. Does looking at cost include all that middle ground?
So sometimes. So it depends on the PBM. The PBM I work for goes off of what's called net cost. So it's the cost that they're actually going to pay, and the net cost that they actually pay, which includes rebates, pharmacy contractings, and anything that comes with it. That would be the net cost they would be considering. Others don't. Others may consider only, some may consider what is called a wholesale acquisition cost, which is going to be how much the wholesaler can buy it for.
Never mind the rebate.
Never mind the rebate. Some may make a decision based off of rebate. If they can make the most money off of that drug, that might, be more beneficial to the PBM. And so the cost is a tough one. We could have a talk about costs. In my class, my students, we have a whole hour dedicated to the costs of prescription drugs, which is crazy. It shouldn't take an hour to talk about how costs come into it. But your ESIs of the world that get huge rebates may be making decisions not off of anything else besides the substantial rebate they may get for a certain product, which they may pass on to the consumer or they may keep for themselves.
Or split the difference.
Or somewhere split the difference. Maybe leaning a little more towards themselves. But that's neither here nor there. All right, so generic drugs, we did get to there. We got 15 minutes left, so we'll at least talk about this. So a generic drug, the idea of generic drugs is they should be perfect substitutes for the originator product. There's no difference really between each generic, and you end up with many suppliers and many consumers, and so what you end up with is a race to the bottom in price. If you have everybody making a perfect substitute, really the patient should land on a product based on cost and really nothing else because they're the same. Now, so what you end up with a final price is usually closest to how much it actually costs to make the drug. So, you know, if you think about this, when there are products out there, like let's say the generic atorvastatin comes out from Lipitor, and the price eventually erodes down to the point where it's only $8 for 30 tablets. Whereas the company before was selling it for $600 for 30 tablets. Now you know what the price markup is for Lipitor. Because the reality is that's all profit. And sure, it was research and development went into that, but they're turning a good profit on that, so they're making much more beyond what they invested typically. And they would argue they need to continue their research and development, et cetera. But, okay, so, you know, how do I look at generic drugs? So I only use generic drugs. If there's a generic drug available, I'm using it. Because the requirements from the FDA is that the active ingredients that go into a generic drug have to be the same that goes into the brand drug. Now, there can be a difference in excipients. And what the excipients means is all the filler, the color, etc. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, couldn't that impact the drug itself? It could, but they have to do testing every time they create a new list of excipients. And you have to realize the brand name manufacturer, the first pill they made of Lipitor does not have the same excipients that they are making Lipitor with today. They make changes to their formulation as well. They make updates to their manufacturing because they find a cheaper way or a more efficient way to put those tablets together. So to think that because you're getting Lipitor always, you're getting the exact same ingredients in that Lipitor every time, that's not the case. But it's maybe more consistent, but they are still able to make changes. And so I think of generic drugs as the same as cookies. Now, you have the same basic, because A, I love generic drugs, and B, I love cookies. You have the same ingredients that go into cookies, right? With some exceptions. You know, maybe you end up with M&Ms in one, and here you've got a little cocoa as the filler instead of your standard flour and sugar. And maybe you got, you know, some raisins that go in it. You throw those cookies away, you find better ones. But the reality of it is the base that goes into cookies is the same. You know, you got salt, sugar, butter, flour, and chocolate chips. And that's essentially what generic drugs are. You have the base ingredients are the same, and they have to be. They have to meet a standard, and not only do they have to meet a standard within that tablet, they have to, or capsule, they also have to meet the standard when it enters into your bloodstream. So the companies have to measure in your bloodstream what is the drug level. And the reason why that's important is because the reality of it is, it doesn't matter what ends up in these cookies. What matters is what ends up in your body, right? Because the pills break them down right away, and they all cross over the stomach, and the vast majority of the product is gone. And now we just want to see what chemicals make it across the blood barrier into the system, and at what levels they get across. And if they're the same for each of the generic drugs and the same as the originator product, then we don't care if they're pink, blue, yellow, white, or any color. And the vast majority of those decisions are made off of questions around what people find to be most appealing when they're taking them. You see a new drug that comes out that may be in a little triangle and it's blue. It has nothing to do with needing to be in a triangle and blue. They did some random testing of patients that really like that triangle blue tablet. And so from now on, it's going to be triangle blue. And so for the vast majority of them, the only decision around how it looks is off of patient preference, and then they have to report out these markings. Because when you call the pharmacy and you ask me as a pharmacist, what is this pill, I need to be able to look it up in a database and tell you exactly what it is. So that's why you may see different letters and numbering on each one, just to highlight who that manufacturer it is and what the product is. Yeah?
So I've been taking this medication for years, and then I got it was a different manufacturer. I didn't even think about that. And the symptoms that the medication was supposed to help, I started getting them. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to need a higher dosage or something. And after about 3 or 4 days, I concluded it was the medication. And I went back to the pharmacy. I used CVS, and they couldn't even get the other. So I went to a small pharmacy. They got the other manufacturer, and it seemed to work.
So,
would you tell us what she said?
Yes, I'll repeat back, annotate what so she said she was taking a medication a long time, and then they changed the manufacturer, and when she changed the manufacturer, she started getting symptoms back that the other product was treating, and no longer, it seemed like the new one wasn't working. So here's what I will say. Is there a possibility that a different manufacturer doesn't work for you? Yes. Is that possibility very high? No. And I'll explain a potential, and this is just a potential explanation. There's been research done with prescription drugs where they will do a switch out of the exact same medication, same manufacturer, it just looks different for high blood pressure medications. And they have seen patients that their blood pressure will go up after they switch to the new manufacturer, and it doesn't work as well. And the reality is their blood pressure went up, so that drug isn't working as well. They pull the blood levels the same, everything else the same, but that medication that isn't working as well. You can't get away from the fact that the blood pressure went up. You can measure it; it's not working as well. So the mind is a very powerful thing. And they've also done studies with high blood pressure medication where they took a placebo, again a sugar pill, and then an actual generic manufactured antihypertensive. They told them that the placebo pill was a new testing drug that they're trying to figure out how it's supposed to be the next best thing for high blood pressure, and this one's the old one that we've always used. And they found that the placebo lowers blood pressure better than the drug that's always worked. It's amazing what your body can do when it perceives something to not work. And it's not saying that it's not even saying that you're making up the symptoms. You may be having the symptoms. Your blood pressure may go up. Does that mean that that drug didn't work as well as the last one? Not always, but it is possible. And so the vast majority of the patients, the vast majority, 99.9999% of patients do just fine from one generic to the next. And I do fine with any cookie to the next. But if I buy it at Starbucks, it costs me $5 and it's only 40 cents at McDonald's. So, yeah.
Is it required that the kinetic profile has to be the same?
Correct. So they do kinetic testing. All generic drugs, when they come to market, have to do kinetic testing to show that they're the same. And if they're the same, they get AB rating, it's called. Now, you may sometimes see drugs that don't get AB rating. I'll give you an example. Effexor XR is a controlled release Effexor. The first generic that came out, known as venlafaxine ER, couldn't show the same profile. It was close, but not the same. So it came out to the market as a generic, but it didn't get AB rating. What that means is, as a pharmacy, I have to get a new prescription from your prescriber that will allow me to fill the venlafaxine ER. But if they get an AB rating to show the same kinetic profile, same production profile, manufacturing profile, then they get an AB rating, and then when you come to the pharmacy, you can get switched over to the generic automatically because they're viewed as, again, perfect substitutes for one another. All right. Now this is making me hungry, so I'm going to move on. All right. So we just have a few minutes left here, but I'll run through some of the utilization management tools that you may sometimes see when you go get drugs. And, oh, hey, there's that slide I was talking about before. See, metformin comes up top. It should always be required as monotherapy first try, and then you open it up to all these other ones that maybe work out as well. So that's the guideline-driven decision-making I was talking about with formularies, and that's what they're trying to do. And so this is a non-PBM decision. This is ADA's recommendation around how medications work, or how medications should be prescribed, and then the PBM uses that information to try and drive their coverage. All right. Oh, so copayment, coinsurance, two different things you may see. Usually when you see rounded numbers like $5, $10, $20 for prescriptions, that's a copayment. It's a set amount you pay based on the tier that it falls under. Whereas coinsurance is a percentage. And the key to that percentage idea is that you may pay a higher percentage at tier 1 and the drug is cheaper. And then tier 2, you may pay, let's say you go from 10% to 25%, so your drug is more expensive and you're paying a higher percentage. So an example of metformin, it may only cost you $250 a month for 10%, and then 25% of Jardiance is going to run you $125 a month. And so it can, as you can imagine, it can add up quick if you have a co-insurance versus co-payment. Co-payments are things like $5 to $50 co-pay difference. All right, so as you can imagine, if you're encouraging use of low-cost generics, it sometimes may feel as though they're trying to make you choose a product that is not the best. Oftentimes, the older drugs that have been around the longest have the best data. That's why they're driving you to them. And really, it's saving you money. If you're willing to take a generic drug versus the newest product, again, you may be only paying $5 instead of $50, and you actually got a better drug. Or you may pay $250 versus $125, and again, you may have a better drug. So realize that the tiering system is not only put in place to make PBMs money, it is also intended to drive your decision towards the product they think is best for you. All right, let's see. Yeah, cost sharing. Depending on the tier, they increase the costs, like we've talked about already. And here's an example. It's 2012. They're not reporting out good quality news stuff here. But you can see the costs go up considerably, and these are averages, which actually may be much higher for certain plans than others. And it just shows that over the years, they've been pushing more and more costs onto you, the individual patient. And so it's important to understand the tiering and what drug you need to end up on, because tier 1 drugs are almost staying flat. Some studies show actually the cost is going down to patients, whereas tier 3, tier 2, and tier 4 are going up and up and up.
Recognizing I have no authority to do this, but I would like to invite you back in a couple of years. As you may have seen this morning, Amazon, Chase,
yeah, there's a third.
Are getting together to create, at least in their goal, is a medical program for something over 1 million employees that they have collectively that will focus on patients without a not-profit at all. I'd be curious in a couple of years for you to come back and report on how successful they are.
Yeah, so the question is, Amazon is saying they're going to get in the health business. And they've been talking about the prescription business for a while. And I don't think a couple years is going to do it.
No,
but it's going to take a while.
Of the collecting that they're doing with Chase Morgan and...
Yeah, so here's what always ends up happening is the problem. You know, a nonprofit doesn't mean nobody's making money. And it sometimes just means you're putting money in certain places. So the idea behind it is great. There are 0 nonprofit PBMs that I know of right now. One of the companies I worked for is filed with the IRS to get that status, but it's tough to find. You don't find many that are willing to do it because there's so much money in this game. And so Amazon is there to make money. And so I'll be tough pressed to see them come out with a true nonprofit status that holds that case. Happy to come back and talk about it. Interested to see where it goes. I'm not that optimistic right now because we have huge companies that were going to fix the problem so many times. Nobody's fixed it. So, all right, so just a couple step therapy. Remember we were talking about how you have to use metformin before using Jardiance? That's what's known as step therapy. So it's the computer system taking a look back at all your claims for however far back they can go and seeing, have you ever used metformin before? And if you've used metformin before, the checkbox gets made in the computer, and now you can get Jardiance if it's preferred. So that's their computerized way to tell you right at the pharmacy. You don't need to fill out any additional paperwork. It just happens behind the scene. Oftentimes you don't know it's happened unless you fail the step therapy. If you fail the step therapy, the pharmacy will get a note back that says, step therapy required, patient must try metformin or tier 1 agent. And if you met that criteria, you just get your tier 2 drug, no problem. Now, sometimes that doesn't give you all the information you need. They may also put in additional pieces that they want to make sure you need to use this drug. So let's say you request Invokana and the preferred agent is Jardiance. Again, same class of drugs. But they want you to try metformin first and then Jardiance before they would consider Invokana, unless you have some reason you can't take Jardiance. This is where your prescriber then can fill out what's called a prior authorization and request that you get coverage for the drug even though it's a non-preferred agent or a non-covered agent. And so this requires additional paperwork, additional clinical information, and goes beyond just the look back of the computer. Now the next step of this is you may get this denied. If your PA comes back denied, your prior auth says, nope, doesn't matter. The paperwork they filled out isn't good enough. We still don't want to cover it. You can then file an appeal and a level 2 appeal. So you have the ability to go beyond that. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and so you have to realize that if you're doing it, you need a significant clinical reason to get the override. Otherwise, they'll just keep denying. And so, and again, it's not always necessarily that they're trying to prevent you from getting a drug that you need. Sometimes they're preventing you from getting a drug you don't need, and they're trying to drive you through the one that you should be using. And that's where that clinical evidence we talked about, can you demonstrate that, that they're the same? And so I think we are officially out of time. I provided Janice with my slide set, so she's welcome to share with anybody if she'd like to. If you have additional questions, I'll be up here for a few minutes, and then I can also share my contact information. You're welcome to reach out.
Could we see the slide of the baby?
Oh, yeah, so we didn't make it to the baby. Here, I was just going to talk a little bit about Medicare. So there's the baby. We've got a 7-month-old at home. The last time I came, she was just brand new, and now she's getting bigger and a lot more fun. One last question, Jim?
What is the best place for us to go through if we want to try and find out what the best drug is, or is that ADA site the best one?
So it's tough. So how do you, and this is that patient choice thing that I brought up, and it's really tough. How do you come in with driving patient choice properly? And oftentimes you got to do some research and find out who is the predominant group that supports the disease that you have, a condition you have, and see what their recommendations are. Like if you have diabetes, the ADA is a great place to go. And so each disease state has a different group that does it, so it sometimes is really tough as a patient to know what is that best product. And this is where trying to come in with an open mind with your prescriber of what's out there, why do you choose the one that you choose, versus me trying to drive you to a brand name only, and then hear what the rationale is from the prescriber, because oftentimes they have good rationale, but it shouldn't just be because it's the newest, greatest thing out there. There should be reasons why you should use this one over that one. And then talk to your pharmacist as well. That's what they're there for. If you have questions about the drugs, don't be afraid to ask, what would you use if you were in my situation?
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Dr. Tomaszewski's PowerPoint will be posted on the OLLI Eclectics page, so you can look for it there, especially the last few slides. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.